Most people who are asking whether the Taliban will collapse are often looking in the wrong direction. They're scanning for foreign intervention, they're looking for mass uprisings, and often looking to the West for a shift in policy. But that is not how collapse happens in a fragile system. That's not how collapse happens in Afghanistan, and especially not in 2025. If we're talking about collapse, real collapse, it often begins from the inside. This can mean a fracture within. It can mean pressure. It can mean silence. Now, welcome to Strategic Echo. My name is Feroz Ibrahimi. I'm the director and founder. And Strategic Echo is a geopolitical advisory firm focused on Afghanistan. We help decision makers, investors, and institutions operate with clarity in high risk regions. This is done through intelligence forecasting, strategic communications, on ground access, and crisis planning. Now, at Strategic Echo, we don't recycle headlines. We forecast disruption, we forecast the future. And today we're going to be diving deep into a topic that often gets overlooked, and because not many people dare to speak about it or dare to forecast, given how geopolitically sensitive and fragile the topic of contention is. We'll be talking about, will the Taliban ever collapse, and why it is the real risk that nobody talks about. So let's get into it. From the outside, looking in, the Taliban does appear entrenched. They control the ministries, they control the borders, the roads, and often the narrative. But control does not mean cohesion, and their authority does not mean unity within Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban in Afghanistan, their government system, their government structure, and their government control is not a monolith. It's layered. It's a layered coalition of tribal loyalties, ideological hardliners, pragmatic administrators, and competing power centers. Now, yes, they did survive international pressure, and yes, they've outlasted internal dissent. But in 2025, their real threat isn't external. The real threat is a risk of internal fragmentation, a slow burning collapse that can be driven by divergence, not defeat. Now, if we break down where those fractures already exist, we can find three core areas. The first fracture is the Kandahari core and the Haqqani network. Now, within the Taliban of Afghanistan, there are two main blocks. The Kandahari core controls the ideology and ultimately the Emirate's foundational vision, whereas the Haqqani core controls intelligence, urban security, and international outreach. They have cooperated for now, but what is important is that they have vastly different priorities. The Kandahari core are very resistant to compromise, whereas the Haqqani network is much more transactional. And as money dries up within the Taliban administration, these decisions get harder, and as a result, contradictions will surface. Moving on, the second fracture is between rural commanders and the central authority. Many of the Taliban fighters on the ground don't feel represented in Kabul. They view the central government as elitist, disconnected, and even corrupt. As a result, this can create the risk of splinter loyalties, where fighters can align with local commanders over central orders. The third fracture is due to the generational tensions. Younger Taliban fighters and administrators who were raised during the insurgency but are now governing a state are facing a major identity crisis. Do they remain militants or do they become managers? This tension is growing very, very quickly, and with no outlet for dissent inside the movement, it could become a huge pressure point for collapse. The next element we need to look into is what is known as the economic time bomb. Now, no government, whether it be Afghanistan or an international country, can survive without revenue. And in 2025, the Taliban's economy is stretched very thin. Humanitarian aid has been slashed. Their reserves remain frozen. Foreign investment is very cautious and tightly controlled. Border revenues are patchy and vulnerable to regional instability. Afghanistan is surviving on customs duties, informal trade, and natural resources that haven't yet scaled. This ends up creating multiple risk layers. Internal competition continues over revenue streams, especially in key crossings such as Spin Boldak, the Torkham border, and Islam Qala. Corruption networks emerging within the Taliban governance. Growing public frustration as services remain weak, inflation rises, and basic needs go unmet. The longer economic pressure builds, the harder it is for the Taliban leadership to manage loyalty. Because when the government can't even deliver even an ideological one, it starts to lose internal gravity. Now let's move on to a different area within the Taliban, and one that can lead to a huge risk outside. Collapse rarely looks like a sudden toppling. More often than not, it can be defection, it can be erosion, it can be silence from commanders who used to answer to orders, and that is where non-state actors come in. ISKP, or the Islamic State Khorasan province, is not about territorial control in 2025. It is about ideological disruption and strategic targeting. They do not need to win districts. They just need to undermine Taliban legitimacy. This can occur through targeted assassinations, bombings in urban areas, or messaging campaigns against Taliban corruption and what is known as ideological softness. And ISKP isn't alone in this. Other proxy elements, which are often funded quietly by regional players or driven by tribal grievances, could begin to peel away support from the Taliban on the ground. Now, all it really takes is one breakaway faction, one high profile defection, or one tribal realignment, and the illusion of the illusion of control can collapse very quickly. So that brings us to the question, will the Taliban collapse? Now, at Strategic Echo, here is what we are forecasting. Collapse will not be dramatic, it will be incremental. If the Taliban does collapse, it can look like this: provincial governors ignoring Kabul, security forces acting autonomously, black market networks outgrowing state controlled ones, religious scholars splitting on interpretations, a surge in anonymous dissent, exile movements, and digital resistance. And through all of that, a legitimacy vacuum. This is where multiple actors begin claiming to speak for the Islamic Emirate. And that's when things begin to move fast. External actors will rush to fill this vacuum, not with troops, but with money, narrative, and local proxies. And it is not the fall of Kabul we're talking about. It is the fragmentation of the Taliban from within. And in 2025 and moving on to 2026, it is not just a possibility, it is also highly plausible. So, to conclude, most people think collapse is something you see coming from a distance, but in a fragile state, in a nation like Afghanistan, collapse begins quietly from the inside out. And if you are not watching the right pressure points, you will often miss this signal. That is why at Strategic Echo, we don't wait for the failure to be obvious. What we do is we forecast early, we track the hidden fractures, and we prepare and brief our clients on topics that others won't say out loud. So if you are operating in Afghanistan, or even if you're watching it very closely, don't ask if the Taliban will collapse. Ask how you will be positioned when it starts to happen. If this topic is something you enjoyed, if this topic is something you want to learn more on, along with other elements of geopolitics, communications, and forecasting relevant to Afghanistan today, then subscribe for real-time forecasting, operator-grade insight, and the intelligence you need to stay ahead of the curve. Because in this region, in Afghanistan, those who see early move first. Thank you for watching.